Welcome to the Getty Centre on this rather grey evening. Tonight we're here to discuss the issues that are affecting change on the historic urban environment and the role of conservation in the 21st century city. My name's Susan McDonald. I'm the head of the Field Projects Department here at the GCI. I'm an architect by training, and I've worked in both Australia and in the UK, both in private practice and in government, on a range of different issues from policy related to materials, historic conservation areas, and a range of other issues to do with legislation and planning and so on. Our work here at the GCI in the area of historic cities began in the 1990s, and our first foray into this field was to work with the city of Quito in their historic core to address a number of issues related to the decline of the historic fabric of that core. Between 2004 and 2009, we then worked with the Organisation of World Heritage Cities as a partner to help them develop their Congress program, which was really designed in a way to encourage discussion amongst decision makers around the various topics that are creating challenges for those constituents, the mayors of mayors of World Heritage Cities and their staff that work with them in their various planning and heritage departments. And some of the topics that we covered in those congresses were to do with the economics of heritage, the role of the varied actors and people that are engaged in decision making in those cities. At the last three congresses and at the next congress to be held in Sintra in Portugal this November, we've also been involved in running a workshop for the mayors of these particular cities, and they have been designed as a forum to discuss more specific issues and to help those decision makers manage these complex issues that they sometimes face as their role as and their principal role as decision makers for those cities. Closer to home, the GCI, or the Getty broadly, actually, widely, is supporting the City of Los Angeles' efforts to initiate and develop a comprehensive program for historic resources here in the city. And since the creation of the Office of Historic Resources in 2006, the city has taken up the gauntlet and is now working on Survey LA, which identifies and provides a hugely important resource for the management of the rich and varied heritage of Los Angeles. And I want to acknowledge our colleague Ken Bernstein here from that office here tonight. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that we've been doing here at the GCI under this initiative of historic cities and urban settlements, you can check out our website. This evening we will be videotaping the proceedings this evening, and they should be up on our website in the not too distant future, I understand. So, conservation at the scale of the historic town or city is one of the great 21st century challenges facing the preservation community. The issues of rapid urban growth and globalization are having a major impact on the historic urban environment. Immigration and population growth have led to the rapid urban expansion of many urban areas across the globe, while smaller urban centres, particularly in rural areas, are facing emigration and therefore often obsolescence, stagnation and decline. Today, over 50% of people live in cities, and the UN has predicted that by 2050, over 75% of people will live in urban areas. These twin poles of growth and decline that I just mentioned, of course, are symptomatic of the larger economic, social and cultural factors that shape a country or a region's development. So, what role can or could or should heritage conservation play in managing these forces of growth, change and decline, and in providing healthy, sustainable urban environments? Is heritage a potential driver for development that offers new economic possibilities? Or is conservation hindering efforts to manage rapid urban growth, modernisation, and to provide higher standards of living? Tonight, we are joined by three panellists who are going to help us delve a little bit deeper into some of the ways these enormous challenges are being addressed and to discuss the role of heritage conservation in managing the 21st century city. We're also going to be continuing this evening's discussion tomorrow when our panellists and I will be working to discuss some of these issues in a bit more detail, and that will become the centrepiece of our special newsletter edition that is due out in the fall, which is on historic urban environments. So I'd now like to welcome and introduce our three panellists, who are each going to present for about 8 minutes in order for us to help frame tonight's discussion. And after the three presentations, we're going to spend about 30 minutes with my panellists having a discussion around some of these issues and addressing some specific questions. And then following that, we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so opening the discussion to the floor, and we invite you to make comments, to ask questions, and to generally join in this discourse. And so to our panellists. Dr. Paul Knox is a geographer by trade, a university distinguished professor at Virginia Tech, where he also serves as a senior fellow for international advancement. Paul teaches, his teaching centres on urban and regional development with an emphasis on comparative study. He serves on the editorial board of several scientific journals and is the author and co-author of numerous books, including Small Town Sustainability, Metroburbia USA, Cities and Design, The Geography of the World Economy and Urbanisation, Human Geography and World Regions in Global Context. In 2008, he received the Distinguished Scholarship Award from the Association of American Geographers. So please welcome Paul Knox. Professor Elizabeth Vines is an architect and has been a partner in McDougall and Vines Conservation Heritage Consultant since 1987. She acts as a heritage advisor to the city of Broken Hill, New South Wales, and I think you're going to see some images from there, and has also advised numerous local government authorities on the establishment of heritage areas, local heritage registers, and the suitability of proposed developments affecting local and state heritage places. Elizabeth is also an adjunct professor at the Centre for Cultural Heritage in Asia and the Pacific, Deakin University, and is the author of numerous reports and publications, including Streetwise Asia, a practical guide. And Liz has worked in many parts of Australia and also in Southeast Asia. Dr. Gabor, excuse me. Please join me in welcoming Liz Vines. Dr. Gabor Demske is a lawyer by training and was elected a Member of Parliament representing one of the constituencies of Budapest in the first free election after the fall of communism in the spring in 1990. He was elected Mayor of Budapest in October 1990 and gave up his parliamentary seat to focus his energies on the city. He was subsequently re-elected Mayor of Budapest for four four-year terms in 1994 to 2006, and he oversaw the task of dismantling the Soviet system, the city's transformation, the creation of economic momentum, and the rebuilding of Budapest's infrastructure, including reconstruction of the Millennium Underground and a new bridge, which I can't possibly pronounce. You can tell me what that is when I come up here. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Gabor Demske. So I'm going to invite Paul Knox to the microphone, and as I said, each of our panellists is going to present for about 8 minutes, and they're going to pass from one to the other, and then we'll sit down here for our discussion.
Thank you, Susan. Good evening, and thank you, Susan, again, and to the GCI for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. It's also a challenge because I explained to Susan earlier on this afternoon, I've spent the best part of 40 years earning my living by speaking in 50-minute chunks, and now I'm faced with 8 or 7, 6. As a result, I've decided not to be tempted to show you too many images. But what I want to do is, to begin with, is to share with you, from my perspective, that as a generalist in relation to historic conservation, someone who's interested in city processes, in urban change, how I would view historic preservation, conservation, in broader context. And for me, it is important to see it in broader context because for me, it's part of a perspective on livability in cities and sustainability in cities, and part of an ongoing process of urban change and remaking. I always like to tell students that you should see cities as palimpsests, as a series of layers that are overwritten. And so what do we decide to keep in that constant process of overwriting? For me, and here I have I've tried to put together a diagram based on what planners often feel is the best way of addressing sustainability, the 3 E's of economy, equity, and environment. And trying to elaborate just a little bit of what might be involved. One of the things that's important about this diagram for me is that many of the elements on here, if we look at the environment and some of the subsets, environmental quality, aspects of authenticity, sense of place, topophilia, which is geographer Ifu Tuan's way of expressing what he believes is a human impulse geared towards the love of place and the importance of sense of place to us as individuals. Questions of meaning and identity, they all share a very high degree of subjectivity. And they all, because of that, bring us into issues of class-based and often income-based, education differential-based conflict. But these elements also conflict with one another very often. So if we look at issues of social justice, economic opportunity, the moral geographies that everyday settings offer to us, the way they instruct us in what is normal, the way that they tend to bring us along to accept the implicit values of the built environment, the taken for granted world, and issues of accessibility within the matrix of urban settings. These are often can run in conflict, of course, with aspects of the environment, and again with the economy. There are so many trade-offs. So there are property conflicts, development conflicts, and resource conflicts, which all have to be taken into account. And for me, one can generalize about processes, one can generalize about cities and settings, but at another level, each case is contingent, each is different, and so one has to bear that in mind. The takeaway from that diagram is that one needs to understand historic conservation in an holistic way. And some of the approaches which I think do that are listed here. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Città Slow movement, the so-called slow city movement, which was born out of a meeting of 4 mayors of Italian cities who were persuaded very much by the slow food movement and decided that as mayors they had the power to influence more than culinary dispositions of their citizens, and established a charter, essentially, which is about having their cake as mayors and as small cities, and also eating it. They're interested in historic conservation, but they're also interested in employment, bandwidth. In other words, they're subscribing to be in the center of that diagram that I just showed you. It's a movement which is spread. It's based in Italy, and there are slow cities. Even Sonoma was the first in this country. A lot of the members don't need too much help in being slow. They're mostly small market towns, but they're interesting to me because they represent cities that have been bypassed by a lot of change that is associated with industrialization, and now having to face either decline or other alternatives which include being swamped by tourism. So when one looks at the economic component of that circular diagram, the component that was bottom left, it's pretty clear that in most cases, context-specific means path-dependent, that what we're looking at these days at any given moment is dependent on the history of the place, the broad history, the economic, demographic, etc., history of a particular settlement of whatever size, and that in turn instructs us as to how we might think about the future and the role of historic conservation. So in broad terms, in very, very broad terms, just to begin to set the scene this evening, there are places, often the market towns. Europe is full of market towns which are established at a convenient distance from one another. The distance very often that could be covered by a carter with or a pack horse in the course of a day, as people moved produce around from place to place. Later on, it was how far you could travel by canal, etc. But with the Industrial Revolution, many of them got bypassed. If they didn't fit the planners of railroads, they were literally bypassed by the technological changes, and they were left often to become picture postcard towns, some of them less fortunate, less pretty, just went into decline. Some of them that had had some early manufacturing, glove making or such, for example, were devastated by the change. But often most of them still exist in some form or another. And for them, historic preservation can leverage investment in some of these standard, more obvious ways that can generate some economic activity. But most of these, as you look at this list, involve a very kind of lopsided economic activity. It's either seasonal or it's low wage, and sometimes both. Some of them are successful. Here's an image from the English Midlands, Ludlow, which is actually a member of the Chittaslow movement. It has had, I can, if anyone's interested, talk in more detail later, but it has had an holistic approach to its development. It's had the involvement of not just the civic leadership, but a number of others, and it takes an approach to historic conservation which goes beyond the built environment. And in fact, in Ludlow's case, rests very heavily on the idea of food. It's a foodie kind of capital. It's got, or it had, I'm not sure what it's got right now, but it was the only place outside of London in the United Kingdom with more than one Michelin rated restaurant. For example, not so far away is Stafford. You can see the architecture. It's Tudor-style architecture is similar, but it's what has been referred to as a clone town. The invasive species of chain stores, national chain stores, has been allowed in and displaced all of the independent local businesses. And if it weren't for some of the distinctive architecture, you'd be forgiven if you didn't know quite exactly where you were. So there are many more failures like this, of course, than there are successes. Then there are places that are bypassed by more recent phases of modernization, where historic preservation and conservation can leverage investment in property-led regeneration. And this, of course, has been the heart of a lot of activity in medium and larger-sized cities. Just to show you one example, I was here last week, Ancoats in Manchester. Particularly interesting, I wanted to walk around it because this was the neighborhood that Friedrich Engels wrote about and that Marx drew on in his theoretical writings. You can see here a fragment of the past, of that past. It's a lock keeper's house on the canal with one of the old cotton spinning factories in the background. Very little of it left. It turns out that in the 70s, urban renewal came along, flattened a lot of the area, and a lot of cheap social housing was put up. That has now been demolished, and it's made way for historic. You can see the arrows pointing to that same lockkeeper's house, and around it is a sort of new build gentrification, which is the current iteration of urban renewal, but very, very much dependent on the idea and the identity of not just Ancoats, but Manchester as as an important city in historic context. So it's an example, in a way, of a neighborhood which is neglected by Mancunians. Its value was very much undervalued until Manchester was trying to put itself on the European map, when in broader context, they have a comparative advantage in terms of people's interest in this particular period and this kind of place. I'm not sure if my 7 or 8 minutes are up, but I'm going to stop there. If I have time in the bank, I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues.
Good evening, and it's wonderful to be here in Los Angeles again, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to be here. I've been here several times, and each time I come, I find that I discover new gems in this city. We were able to explore a 1970s Gary's print workshop, where he exposed the structure of that building, and little cameos like that I take home with me. What I would like to talk about is heritage, which is undoubtedly a catalyst for economic and social development, and cover issues in Australia and Asia. In Asia, I consider there are 3 key obstacles for achieving appropriate heritage conservation outcomes. Firstly, the rapid population growth and associated need for housing in cities puts huge pressures on heritage areas. The cities themselves, exemplified by Hong Kong, Shanghai, Bangkok, and others, have changed so dramatically in a short time period that the stories of these places can be swept aside. Where towns or cities have valued their heritage qualities, international recognition via World Heritage listing is keenly sought for the obvious economic spin-off. But also local planning ordinances are generally ignored and have no legal teeth. But this can lead to a second obstacle for appropriate conservation. Increased visitor numbers to a site can result in tourist swamping, as we see here in these images. Whilst the economic benefits are evident, who is it that benefits? So often, as reported in Wuzhan West, a canal town in China, the town becomes emptied of inhabitants, many of whose families have been there for generations. The towns themselves become sanitised, and the consequences of tourist visitation can destroy the very asset that the World Heritage listing is seeking to achieve. The third issue I consider is fakery or façodomy. One of my former Hong Kong University students who's involved in managing a wonderful now listed World Heritage site in southern China, you can see the dot there showing you where it is, the star, which was inscribed on the World Heritage list in 2007. Just 2 weeks ago asked me, how do I stop all heritage sites in China becoming fake, new looking and functioning as heritage theme parks? So since listing, a fake, and sorry, here are some more images of that extraordinary site with over 3,000 of these dialos scattered through a cultural landscape. So since its listing, a fake Heritage entry gate has been erected. You can see the arrow there on the left, and one of the 4 villages, which is the first that's had work on it, has had over-restoration of its buildings. In one of the courtyards, a fake heritage hotel has been constructed. New parking areas to accommodate tourist buses, and generally fast erosion of the authenticity of this very special place as visitor numbers are rapidly increasing. In Hong Kong, the recent government-led initiative to identify about 10 key projects owned by government, sites owned by government. This is its first one, which has just been completed a couple of years ago. It's known as 1881 Heritage. It was, as you can see, the former headquarters of the Hong Kong Marine Police. It's been transformed into this Disneyland conversion of a once significant site. I was in Hong Kong, as I said, teaching a couple of weeks ago, and I hope that the next major project identified by the government and being made available, unfortunately, in secrecy without the, I believe, necessary public consultation input into the final scheme, will result in a better conservation outcome. Another current project that we've actually been involved with, advising the University of Hong Kong on 3 heritage buildings on the campus in this city squeezed for space, obviously didn't consider the necessary curtilage or setting of these buildings. And you can see here 3 buildings jammed between the new western expansion of that university campus. And despite the Conservation Management Plan prepared for these buildings, once a decision had been made to retain them, that it was important to retain some sense of setting, this obviously hasn't occurred. Now in Penang, inscribed with Malacca on the World Heritage List in 2008, a vigilant local community is demanding that these impacts are better managed. Threats of morphosodomy, removal of original elements, inappropriate new development, unrestrained signage, and new tourist hotels. And I show this one with very mixed emotions. I actually stayed here a month ago. It was a delightful place to stay in. Each of the room was high style and very comfortable. But on the outside, this is what had happened to this building. And this has occurred since listing as a World Heritage Site. Clearly the highest accolade that a place in the world can receive, with presumed clear controls and restrictions, but this is what is happening to the authenticities of the place. And all of this community is demanding will not continue, and that they will have more say in how this place is managed. So what about Australia? We, of course, have less population pressure, but we still experience obstacles to conservation. This is a very similar one to North America. Pressures on our inner cities for profit from property development is ever present. We are fortunate to have a planning legacy from the 1970s and 80s, where community uprising against demolition of heritage places resulted in individual and area protection of consistent residential and commercial areas. And these areas, as it has been the case here in the States, are now highly sought after and extremely expensive, particularly little cottage housing or higher style housing, which you see here in inner Melbourne. But this pressure for profit is evident in the recently approved, again in Melbourne, Windsor Hotel development, despite the proposal, and here you see it, being 20 stories over the regulation height. And here I've arrowed the tower block for you to see, and I'm always intrigued with architects' sketches, the top left showing how ethereal and how disappearing this tower is behind the development, and how the original will still be the dominant element. My second obstacle in Australia is inappropriate skills at local government level, planning frameworks being ignored, and adherence to planning policies. And this is just a view of development in my home city, Adelaide, in heritage areas where clearly the new development plays no pays no reference to the style of the houses. And the third obstacle, familiar to you here, I'm sure, in the current economic climate, which is lack of funding and resources. Country towns and regional cities face specific challenges where a change in economic base can lead to a population loss. Mining towns have boom and bust cycles, and an example is Broken Hill, where I have worked for the past 25 years, and I will show you in Australia the star where Broken Hill is located, and some views of this city. So rather than depending totally on mining, which can be uncertain, this city of 20,000 people has reinvented itself as a vibrant heritage city set within a living desert. It's quite an arid climate. So how has this been achieved? Firstly, by understanding what is significant about the place. That is, understanding the history, the unique characteristics that set it apart, the style of architecture, the development of the town. Secondly, by developing a planning framework which protects these identified assets and values of the place. And then by implementing, thirdly, by implementing these planning controls consistently together with financial incentives and free expert heritage advice. And here you can see some examples of befores and afters of buildings. All of this is in accordance, this process that I'm talking about, with a charter that which we Australians use called the Borough Charter, and we follow that three-step approach as conservationists. So the community and a strong local government have been key players in this process in Broken Hill, with development of local initiatives such as an art gallery in a restored heritage building. Here you can see it in its 4 iterations. 1889, 1894 when it was extended, it was defaced in the 50s, which is often what happened, and then adapted as an art gallery at a time when the building's life was threatened by fire and vandalism. And this has now become the home for a very vibrant art community in this part of Australia, and a showcasing area for local artists as well as for travelling exhibitions. Now, this has also, of course, been assisted by lack of population pressure in this city, but this city has certainly averted the economic collapse by building on its heritage assets that Paul was referring to before, when there is this exodus. This city was projected to be a population of 9,000 people. The year 2000, it's sustained its population of about 20,000 people. In nearby Wilcannia, a remote outback town, which has a high percentage of unemployed Indigenous people, a very modest heritage program introduced 4 years ago has similarly received some good results and achievements. This is firstly focused on a stone conservation program. This town has a lot of sandstone buildings. It was a key port area along the Darling River. And by developing a conservation program which focused on repointing and upgrading stone buildings and teaching local people how to use lime mortar and the appropriate mortar, this has resulted in a modest change and a steady change in this town, as you can see here on some of the projects in hand. We have secured funding from the economic stimulus package as part of our government's trying to avert a decline in our economy by injection of funds. And in this case, because there was a strategy in place for this modest town, they were able to secure some of this funding and restore a couple of key buildings. So upgrading buildings alone, of course, doesn't turn an economy around, but it can provide a new pride and a new self-image, as I've shown in these 2 examples, as well as, importantly, providing local jobs and skills training. So I believe that maybe Asia is now experiencing what we in Australia experienced in the 1980s, but of course with different factors of population explosion not shared in our country. The cultural benefits associated with heritage conservation are often intangible. They are difficult to quantify, and as Paul said, they're subjective. And I believe in both Asia and Australia, the balance of change and modernisation with the retention of authenticity of our cities and towns is a key challenge. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will speak about Budapest, the city of minuscule wonders, how I call it. And unfortunately, about 40 pictures are missing from the PowerPoint presentation. Miraculously, they disappeared on the way from Budapest to here. And I have to talk about the problems which we caused to ourselves in the process of rehabilitation in the last 2 decades in the city. And you have to imagine, instead of looking at the pictures, what I am speaking about. So what does the protection of urban appearance mean in Budapest? When one considers this issue, there are several points to be taken into account. The beauty and unique character of the Hungarian capital is due partly to its specific architectural treasures. There are relatively few buildings of particularly outstanding aesthetic value among these last, or buildings which are prominent due to their construction several centuries ago, namely to their age of several hundreds of years. Instead, there are a large number of houses, ensembles of buildings, streets, and quarters of the city that radiate charm and a pleasant atmosphere of their own, and which were built with great mastery and care. One could say that Budapest is not a city of few world-famous artistic treasures, but more a place of minuscule wonders, and this is the primary reason why tourists visit and citizens love it. The next point of consideration, which cannot be disregarded and is visible to all who live in the city, is that the buildings significantly deteriorated during the decades after World War II. Occasional renovation and campaign-like serial refurbishing was done, primarily in the most conspicuous locations, but by and large it was rather lack of ownership, neglect and decay that characterized the city. This particularly affected the minuscule wonders mentioned above, buildings which did not enjoy heritage protection, the ornamentation of facades, statues, gateways, and glass windows. The third crucial fact is the lack of resources. Owners of property, whether private individuals or institutions, usually do not possess the sums necessary for independent restoration of these often damaged buildings and structures. And now I have to stop for a moment, because Budapest is an extremely decentralized city. That means that in the city we have 23 independent districts. They elect their own councils. The people there elect the mayors directly as well. And these cities, according to the law, are equal with the city of Budapest. So they are not subordinated to the city. That means that there are parallel structures in all fields. I used to say, when I was the mayor, that the districts are strong enough to veto everything in the city, but not strong enough to make anything. And in this field, in the field of rehabilitation, it is particularly problematic because certain districts want to take part in the program which we described and which the city is funding in the budget of the city. Yes. that helps to me. For instance, here is the 9th district of Budapest, where gentrification is going on. A very successful program, city rehabilitation from private resources. That means that the people who lived here, low-income people, they move out, and instead of them, high-income families are moving in, and the city is upgrading. Here, in the next district, the 8th district, almost nothing happened for 15 years, and now a program has been started which we call social rehabilitation. That means that we want to keep the people who lived there, low-income families, to live and stay in the 8th district, and we started the program with public money and partly with European money, which we call social rehabilitation. That means that we renovate not only the buildings, but also we try to educate the people. We have reconstructed a factory which is now functioning as a cultural center there, and it is this part of the city is also upgrading. A large number of the people, low-income people, are there Roma, so gypsies, and also very many low-income Hungarians. So it was like a poor ghetto, which now, after 5 years, is getting better and better, and the life conditions are improving. Here, in the center of the city, you see the Jewish part with 3 synagogues, and this part is a negative example. Here we could not achieve that the district leadership, the mayor and the council, we could not convince them to take part in the program which we started, and they practically demolished partly the Jewish part of the city. So unfortunately, the districts are giving the permission to build and the permission to demolish, and they have done it. And it's the part of the city where we could not intervene because of this decentralized structure what I was speaking about. The other mistake that the Hungarian Parliament committed in 1992 was that it was the fastening of the privatization of the apartments. For 50 years, all apartments in the city, there are about 850,000 apartments, were local government owned. And in 1992, the Parliament accepted a law, a new law, and according to that, every tenant has a right to buy the apartment on a very low price. That means that about 700,000 apartments were sold, mostly to low-income people who are not able to take part in the process of rehabilitation because they do not have money for it. So this is, I think it was a mistake which we have to correct. And how we do that? That is the question. The question is that how then it is possible to pursue an effective policy for the protection of urban appearance. Yes, we have 2 instruments to help this process. One is the Heritage Fund, which is a flexible fund to protect heritage buildings and buildings under local protection and not classified buildings as well. And the owners may receive non-refundable subsidy. this is, I think, here it is very important to emphasize that these are privately owned buildings. So we give taxpayers' money to the owners, in spite of it that theoretically it should be their own duty to finance the rehabilitation alone. But it doesn't work. And because of that, we give public money to help the reconstruction of these buildings. The other form is also a kind of support. This is the assistance to the protection of settlement value, which was established in 1993. Subsidies may be obtained on the basis of application invited annually for the restoration of buildings not included in the National Heritage List, but which are classified by the municipality in the category of buildings and ensembles of buildings enjoying local protection. So also the state partly gives non-refundable grants and partly repayable loans, and the money collected as repayment may subsequently increase the funds to be distributed. As a result of the subsidies granted by the state and by the Heritage Fund, so the two funds, altogether more than 2,000 works have been completed in Budapest, to the point where the strollers of Budapest already sense the extent of achievement. The elaborated constructs of support seem to have worked, and the urban appearance of Budapest, even if at cost of major efforts, has been continuously and spectacularly regaining its characteristic beauty. Last but not least, I think what we need in this process is very strong public involvement, strong local government involvement, very strong leadership, which is able to enforce the regulations. And last but not least, you need a not decentralized, but centralized, strong city with one council, one mayor for one city, and not 24 with 600 elected representatives. How much we have, you can imagine how easy it is to convince 600 people, all politicians from different parties, and 23 mayors who do not care, only with their own re-election, about programs like that, which I tried to describe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, great. So thank you very much to our three panellists for your presentations and helping us to frame the discussion for this evening. I would like to ask you all a few questions now, and then, as I said, for the last period, we'll open it up to the floor. One of the things, Paul, that you mentioned and that we hear a lot from practitioners, and it was something that came up at an expert meeting that we had here at the Getty a year or so ago, was the need for an integrated approach, the need to embed conservation within the economic and social and cultural development of towns and cities. But in reality and in practice, this seems to have been something that cities and governments have found quite difficult to do. And so perhaps if I could ask you, Liz first, and then Gabor, how challenging did you find it, or have you found in your experience, it to achieve that need?
Generally pretty challenging, although my role as a practitioner, as a consultant coming into, invited I suppose, to come into a city or town, is to challenge the local authority and the community to see their heritage assets not as a constraint but as an opportunity to kind of shift a point of view. And I'm only there by invitation, so obviously that shift has started to happen. But generally, in city planning ordinances and in city governance, it's all about economic growth, about survival, and there is this point of view that the past, the heritage assets from the past, are seen as our past story, not our future, not our imagined new future. And so it's really enrolling people in becoming excited about. Often as an outsider, you see things afresh. People who have lived in a place for a long time take it all for granted. So as an outsider, you're able to participate in a discussion, an imaginative discussion about, well, what is it that makes this place special? And how do you vision this place in the future? And if it has strong heritage qualities, which is where I work, and so generally it does, how is it that you can manage and create the most out of these assets? And then, as I said in my talk, you know, the 3 steps that we generally follow is firstly understand what is significant about the place, so understand its history, and then secondly, to hopefully via consensus modes of communication, to agree on the kind of objectives that you have, and thirdly, and policies, and thirdly, to implement those. But it's not, that's the ideal approach, and it's sometimes problematic.
So theoretically, they all, I mean, the politicians in my city, they agree that it's an important subject, that it has a value, it is our future, and so on. But if they have to pay, they have to sacrifice from the district budget, let's say, or they have to choose between 2 subjects, then usually it is very difficult to achieve a support for these purposes. I have a lot of experience with politicians, local politicians, in my 20 years time, and at least with 200 mayors I worked together, and not more than 10 were really good in this field, and they who wanted to sacrifice and who took part in the program which the city has started. So I think politicians, mayors have to be educated, and it is good models have to be shown to them. So why it is important and what kind of changes they can achieve through these methods.
Right. Okay, thank you. Paul, you showed a couple of examples of where conservation did seem to be sort of recognised as being integral to that idea of livability and quite linked into other civic and environmental issues. Of some of those examples that you showed, the City Slow and some of the other things, what do you think was at the core of the success of those programs where heritage did seem to be quite well integrated into other programs within those cities?
Yeah, I guess with the caveat that every case is different. The example that springs to mind is Hersbruck in Germany. It's a small market town. The answer there was the involvement not just of the mayor and the folks that are working in small local government agencies, but local business leaders and leaders of advocacy groups of different kinds, not just conservation groups. And they enjoyed one another's company. They enjoyed the game. And because of that, they worked very effectively together. And they put in a program. This is a small town that was very important at one point in the medieval trade route between Nuremberg and Prague. And so their interest was in promoting the economic history. Right. So among the things that they were able to do as to they've got some very nice brass markers in the principal streets in the town, which replicate that routeway and which have different products, the products that were traded along that route. They've got programs to support and sustain heritage crops, the cultural landscape, and so on and so forth. So it's a very much an all-round approach, but drawing in those, the secret there was the
the key actors.
Right.
It's hard to say how much the community itself is supportive, or at least even understanding what they're up to. They enjoy the products of the work of these key actors, but so it's hard to say that it's really a grassroots, but it's much more than the civic leadership that's involved in that particular example.
And perhaps I can talk about the people that are involved. And I'm interested to hear your opinions about whether you think that city planners and managers and politicians that are involved in managing cities and urban areas see heritage as an asset or a liability, and whether there are, when you get inconsistent views, it becomes very problematic. And as a politician, Gabor, your fellow mayors, you were saying, some of them are signed up, but some of them weren't. What about the other planning, the planners and the other government officials that were working in your cities? Were they, was heritage a problem, or was it something that they understood might be important to their city?
So the problem starts earlier in Budapest, because the districts, they are selling the apartments, and half of the money what they collect in that way, they should give it to the city of Budapest, and we reallocate that amount for city rehabilitation purposes. And they do not give that part, so, and we cannot sue them. So there is a very strange situation that there is a law that they should, but they do not, simply refuse. And that means that we have much less for this purpose, how much we would need it and how much they would apply for. And these districts are excluded from the system because they do not pay, they do not get anything, so they are outside. And what we have done, it was that we had a stronger cooperation with the inner part of the city, with the historic side, and we neglected the rest if they would not exist. We could not do anything else. Plus, in the city hall, there was a division. I don't know whether my successor kept it or not. Maybe not. It's a division which was responsible for these programs.
Right.
Professionals, a team of professionals, mainly architects, at least 24 of them. And they developed the programs, they were selling the programs. These were offers. If you take part in the program, you can get this. Money plus the plans. And that was how we tried to get them involved.
So who was responsible for creating that department? Was that your job as mayor?
Yes.
Right.
I
So it
it
started with a vision from a politician.
I love this subject, and yes,
Yeah.
it was my passion.
Right. Liz, how about that?
Well, I'd like to share with you what happened in Melbourne. I think your question about planners and politicians and so forth. In the 70s, as I mentioned, there were many quite violent debates and demonstrations about demolition of key buildings in the city, central city. And by the early 80s, the then Conservative government had got voted out to a more progressive left-wing government. And the Minister for Planning was an architect, actually someone who I had done work experience with. And he had a vision, and he had passion, and he had power. And I think a key thing about heritage conservation is leadership from key people. And there had been this enormous debate about conservation areas, which I'm a great believer in, that if you have historic districts, it's a much more equitable way of managing heritage than it is by singling out buildings. Because if you're in an area, everybody obeys the rules, you have a sense of certainty, you know your neighbour isn't going to build something 5-storey high and therefore devalue what you've got. So you've got this equitable distribution of planning policies within this area. That was hugely contested, and it was seen by the Liberal government then to be that people would lose value because they couldn't redevelop their sites. Now, it was the opposite that was the case. So in 1982, this hero of mine, a fellow called Evan Walker, an architect, a planning minister, in the first couple of months of office, they're in for 3 years, first couple of months of office, he designated these areas, and there was a great deal of discussion about it, but everything died down. Now those are the most expensive, sought after, low intensity, but highly sought after areas for people to live and work. So I think a key thing is about leadership from politicians. And then at that time, there was the recognition in this city. I talk about Melbourne, it's my home city where I grew up. I don't live there now, but I think it's a key international city example of having leadership and then also having expertise. And so there have been key players in the local government who've been in their jobs for 25 to 30 years, and I hope that there's good succession planning. But these people have had consistency. You've talked about consistency of implementation of the rules. And I have a couple of current projects in Melbourne, and without compliance of the consistency, you get approval to do a heritage project. This is what happens in Asia all the time. You get approval and then you do something different. Well, why do you get approval? In Melbourne, and generally in Australia now, if you get approval, you have to stick to that approval, and if you don't comply with that approval, work is stopped. So you have to have teeth associated with the decisions that have been made by the planners and by the people in the city office. So certainly I think it's about political will to have this vision that you've talked about, and then it's about having expertise within the staff and if you're lucky, holding those staffs for long periods of time so you have this consistency.
I couldn't agree more about the area designation aspect of it. What occurs to me, Susan, in terms of your question is as heritage is, I think, inevitably going to become more important as an issue, as society becomes increasingly engrossed with Facebook, social networks and so on, we kind of empty out part of our world and we want to replace it with the sense of place. Heritage is part of that. And because of that, in the political sense, there's going to be much more opportunity for identity politics around heritage. And so what it means, what this district or that building means to me or to you, to somebody else. The example that springs to my mind, because I was there recently, is in Washington, D.C. The African American district that was very important for the first half of the 20th century became known as Black Broadway. Was a cultural, political, intellectual center, and because of that received historic designation as a district. But as a district, it fell into disrepair and decay after the riots, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And slowly, the district has been repopulated, in large measure by Ethiopians, who now want to label the district as Little Ethiopia. Which has caused a great deal of friction. So the local politics there center around that question of identity and what heritage means to different groups. I think from the planning point of view, what's interesting to me is the way that when there is money available, it creates a new set of rules for the game. And so you get the interagency politics can be...
you mean government money for funding?
For example, European Union money has been very important in much of Europe. It's been very influential and I think very positive. But it's created a dynamic at the local level where different agencies have sought to advance their own bureaucratic turf by going after those funds or deploying different strategies in the way they use it, and not always in a way that's consonant with the overall objectives of the city government or the mayor. So those nuances can play out with some often unintended consequences.
Given what you've all said, and we were discussing this a little bit earlier this afternoon, the importance of political vision and will, and then professional support behind that. What would you suggest the conservation profession might need to do to better engender that political support and then vision? Is there, and how do we help develop that passion and that will in our politicians?
Well, perhaps if I comment on that, I think training programs and education programs at a whole variety of levels, starting with school kids, you know, in the curriculum about understanding your neighbourhood and you know, opening their eyes to details and so forth. So educating from early on, but also having available for elected representatives training in the kinds of things that we assume they know about, but they don't. You know, this isn't their area of expertise, and so these training programs, workshops, informal gatherings, these kinds of events where people talk about these kinds of issues, showing examples from elsewhere, not as solutions. And often, I mean, we have a court building in Darwin which the Chief Minister brought back in a postcard from the Middle East and said, I want one of these. It's not for that reason to show other examples, but it's basically to understand what other people are doing, and what you can learn is good and bad from what they've been doing, and then say, how can we do this ourselves differently and evolve our own solutions for our own city?
Yeah. I think education is at every level. It's a long-term thing, but it's probably the most fundamental. I think also it seems that networks are important. Networks are small networks of cities to let politicians benefit from one another, from best practices, and it also seems to engender a certain amount of competitiveness. So once a town or a city is in, and again the EU I think has been particularly active in promoting all kinds of intracity and intercity networks. That sense of competition and identity and civic pride, it's almost going back to the 19th century competitiveness among cities to build grand city halls, but these days it's not the city hall, the edifice itself, it's the historic continuity and sense of place that's often important, along with things like sustainability and livability, healthy towns. So networks of one sort or another, I think, are very useful. The trick is getting the leadership to subscribe to one or more of those networks.
Sometimes this topic is much more complicated, because there was a certain period of time, beginning of the 20th, end of 19th century, when these cities in Europe were very rapidly developing. And very small and unhealthy apartments have been built in my city, in other cities as well, in England as I know. And the argument against city rehabilitation is many times that why should we protect these buildings, which, okay, from outside look well, but there isn't enough light, it is unhealthy, and so on. And people do not want to live in apartments like that in the 21st century. That was the argument in the old Jewish district of the mayor. And he brought to me a lot of people from the district who were protesting against rehabilitation of the district. And they told that they want to live in new apartments, new modern apartments in that place, because they are accustomed to live in the center of the city. And you know, these arguments have to be taken seriously, because really there are very narrow streets, you know, from the Middle Age, no light, and the apartments I would not like to live in. So they are right. And what is the solution of this problem, as I see? That these apartments should be kept in the property of the state, local government, district, public property, and used as a social policy instrument, as a social apartment, on very low rent, given to poor families. Otherwise, we cannot maintain them. So, or you have to accept that there are certain category of buildings which have to be demolished in spite of their age and in spite of the architectural value.
I would hope as an architect, though, that there's potential for adaptation for these buildings, opening up interiors and so forth, and arguing that they have embedded energy in them. If we talk about sustainability, that if we're demolishing, putting into landfill material, then building new buildings, that we're using a lot of energy, whereas it's possible to adaptively reuse these apartments, not as they were designed, but as newly adapted, you know, two become one. The services become upgraded, and do a cost comparison between that and the new, and it's often line ball. And if it has a certain character and uniqueness and history, which is, you know, specific to Budapest, and that's what you're trying to achieve, then you can get both outcomes, I would have thought. Hopefully.
Certainly that issue of livability and people rightly wanting a modern, an acceptable standard of living for the 21st century is a challenge that we hear in many parts of the world, I think. I'm going to actually stop our internal discussion here and open it up to the floor for comments or questions, or for people to perhaps engage in that particular that issue we were just talking about. Yes, up here.
Hello, and thanks for this great presentation. I've become very fond of the idea of literally greening buildings and districts and cities by adding significant amounts of both horizontal and vertical greenery in the form of flowers and plantings, but also green walls and hanging plants of various kinds. Now, in whole districts of cities, for example, now when it comes to doing it on buildings of mostly newer structures of indifferent architecture, I think mostly that will be seen as a really good idea for creative, modern, present-day architects to interact with the architects of the last generation or two in that particular way, and coming up with, because I'd love to live in a city that's got far less in the way of billboards and more in the way of greenery. And but I'm also interested in seeing this done perhaps with some of the really beautiful heritage buildings, especially, and maybe in a couple of cases, really large monumental ones. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Hungarian Parliament building in Budapest, built in the late 19th century. I look at pictures of it and I think, my God, that would be fantastic if maybe even only on a seasonal basis, it was covered with hanging flowers and vines and become really colorful. And what a great tourist attracting jobs generating activity that would be. And maybe on a permanent basis, the hulking Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, Romania, built by Ceausescu in the late 20th century. The fantastic stuff could be done with that. It would make the city more of a tourist draw. Just imagine coming with the streams of flowers and plants, and then constructing perhaps even above it a structure that's again as high as the existing building. They could be covered with more flowers to create an urban habitat for, well, maybe bats. And or solar electric structures. It would. Anyway, any ideas you have on this kind of a vision?
Thank you.
Liz, you're the architect. Do you want to go first?
Well, I'm a great fan of green walls. I think they're wonderful, and I think it's fantastic that they're being developed, and rooftop gardens and green buildings and so forth. I agree greatly with what you're saying. And I think it's important just to work out where they're most appropriate. And often, you get ends of buildings which are blank, and that's clearly a good place, as opposed to part of the original design of the facade, which I think sometimes is best left to itself to express its original design. But I think you've got a great point, and I'm a great tree planter in cities and green wall advocate. Does a lot of positive things for our environment.
Yeah, I think how you get there, from this kind of vision, it comes back to the question of leadership again. Clearly Mayor Daley in Chicago's taken leadership in terms of greening that city. Probably as an outsider, it might have been one of the last, maybe Detroit, but would be even a bigger challenge, but he's been successful. But you can also achieve a lot through what might otherwise be perceived as rather mundane fiscal policy. In Switzerland, for example, green roofs are almost mandated in terms of the tax break that you can get with a new building. If you put a green roof on it, it becomes prohibitive not to do it. And so straightforward legislation like that can have an incremental long-term effect.
I agree totally with you, and when we became Hungary the member of the European Union on the 1st of May 2004, then we celebrated it in that way that we paved with grass the bridges of Budapest. Imagine that. No traffic, green grass. People were walking, hanging around. Beautiful day.
Yes, indeed. Okay, we have a microphone here and then one behind.
Yeah, I have more of a technical question. All of the places that you were talking about are outside of the United States. I'm pretty familiar with what we have here in Los Angeles because we have a historical overlay that we have to design to the various independent cities have their own planning commissions and they have to design to those things. The one thing that always had a question in my mind when I traveled, for example in Asia or even in Europe in the older cities, that knowing our life and safety standards, distances, exits, etc., in these countries where in these old buildings, life and safety is not up to code or not today's standards. Do the cities or the the planning commission, or is the building department cooperating in loosening up the standards? Because when you want to restore these old buildings, you can't bring them up to code. How do you deal with trying to have life and safety, which is number one, and then the aesthetics and trying to stay with the historical look of a building? How does it work together with you and the city officials who have to maintain the codes and who have to enforce them?
Well, I think that there's a lot of European cities that have paid quite a lot of attention to those life and safety issues. So I know in the UK, when I was working at English Heritage in the 1990s, there was a lot of issues to do with accessibility, with upgrading things for fire, for a whole range of safety issues. And with the legislation in some of these countries, historic buildings, I mean, it's different in different places. They have to comply as far as possible, and then there are some relaxations and there are some special provisions in some of those legislations. I know in Australia that's true, but there are often architects have become a lot more creative about how to deal with some of these things, and they work quite closely with the regulators in planning departments or other government departments that are administering some of those things. I'm not sure in Budapest how it's been dealt with, or if Liz, you want to comment more on Australia.
My comment listening to that is not directly on the technical side. I think one of the differences between this country and certainly Europe, and I can't speak to Asia, is the promptness with which litigation follows and any kind of an accident, so health and safety. So I think there's a little more of an elastic, there's more of a sense of personal responsibility for health and safety in European culture than there is here, where it seems to me that a lot of the code is framed around fear of litigation rather than a concern over people's safety, railings, steps, and all the rest of it. So I think that's one of the reasons you don't see in an old castle, for example, you don't see the steps with the addition of railings. that okay, if you want to visit, it's your personal responsibility not to trip up and fall, and you're not going to have half a dozen lawyers on your back if it happens. That seems to me a cultural difference in the way that that we approach things.
I mean, certainly as an architect working with these issues, it's ever problematic, but it's part of your responsibility. I mean, there are these codes, and certainly in Australia we've just had a new upgrade of our DDA, Disabled Access codes. They've been made more stringent, not less. The issue about the front door, not the secondary door, and all of these can be problematic for heritage buildings. And I think that it's part of your role to really try and negotiate the best solution for all parties. That is for the people, obviously, who need the access, and people do need access, equitable access. I think it's very important. But I also think there are heritage objectives as well. And I think these need to be balanced, and there are times where you say, and you might be unpopular, but you say, well, in this case there is a door just around the side. It will not negatively impact on the front facade. It is clearly visible. You can become unpopular by having that position. My comment on Asia is that they're very lax on these kinds of issues. They get away with stuff we cannot possibly get away with. I can't speak for the US, but certainly for Australia. There are many regulations, particularly scaffolding. You've only got to go to Asia with this one-dimensional bamboo scaffolding without boarding. See people up there and they regularly fall off. I mean, that would not be countenanced in my country. So different safety standards. But I think that's changing. Just as I think the whole evolution of heritage protection and legislation is changing in Asia as people become more articulate about what they want to keep, and I use the Penang community as an example.
I think we've got time for one more. Just on.
Last year, Prince Charles won a round against Richard Rogers in the Chelsea Barracks development, but he lost two other rounds around St. Paul's. One, the Jean Nouvel's new crystalline shopping mall at One New Change, and the development of Paternoster Square, which he had proposed like a more, more traditionalist kind of approach than what ended up, which was kind of a mediocre mixed bag. But his ideas, which I really liked, were dismissed as historicist pastiche, or perhaps fake, as you put it. And I'm wondering, not so much in conserving existing things, but trying to develop compatible environments around major areas. It seems like today's celebrity architects mostly totally ignore Dr. Knox's environmental variable. The idea of sense of place, appropriateness, it's like all their particular forms. And I think in particular the Jean Nouvel thing is beautiful, but it doesn't belong right next to St. Paul. So I wonder how you would deal with those issues of trying to balance, trying to come up with something appropriate in a major area, which should be a conservation area, like a place like St. Paul's.
This is such a great question. And, this whole thing about starchitects and where are they coming from, that is that they're... I mean, we in my training in architecture, and it's not much different now, we were not taught about context. We were not taught about respecting the context in which we were to insert a building and the sensitivities of that context. We were taught to respond to our client, and our client wanted a big new building, and there was no training in this area. And this is a role that I play a lot in my home city in Adelaide, but also as a consultant many times, that is to assist a city council in assessing the appropriateness of new development, whether it's good or not. And that you can get yourself into a lot of trouble with contemporary architects, often the high flyers, who kind of say, how dare you question my... who are you to question, my response to this site? And I know Paternoster Square quite well, and I don't know the Nouvel example you're talking about. But I think there are aspects of that development which are quite successful. And I think that contexts as, important as the St. Paul's or any iconic building, the insertion of new development is a very difficult one. But look at what Gary, does in places like Bilbao. So you've got from one extreme where you get put on the map by a new building, and to the other extreme where I think it's really important to respect the tradition of the style that you're inserting it into, that you actually having guidelines is a good idea. We get howled down, our Institute of Architects howls down heritage guidelines. They say they constrain them too much. But I think the majority of successful new development actually does build on the pattern and rhythm and setback and height and colour tones of what the context is.
And that issue's been a really big problem at the World Heritage level. In fact, so much so that they had a series of international meetings over the last 6 years to address exactly this question of this idea of starchitects designing very contemporary buildings in the centre of city, usually at a request of, it'd become a political thing about putting that city on the map, as Liz just said, cities of Liverpool, St. Petersburg, Vienna, just to name a few that had this very specific problem. It happens to be something that we're quite interested in looking at the Getty here, and I know that one of the most successful approaches to having that conversation has been the work that CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, did in the UK with their architects and their heritage environment. And we did a very small version of that in Sydney, Australia, where we worked with the Institute of Architects to have joint policy. So it was our policy as the Heritage Office and their policy as the Institute of Architects. That's what good development, new development looked like in the historic environment. And that was a very nice, small, interesting way of approaching it and about having that conversation, because it's a good idea for each generation to be contributing to the built-in environment, which is in a way that is represents their moment and their time. But as preservationists, we're looking for that to be done in a way that is also respectful and can add to the significance of that already significant historic central core. So it was an interesting exercise.
Yeah, I think that the Bilbao Guggenheim has a lot to answer for, because it's become the idea of urban regeneration through starchitecture is so appealing to so many communities that it plays into this whole contemporary cultural idea of branding. Everything has to be branded. So interesting book by the title of Brandscapes, whose author, his name escapes me right now. And of course each of the starchitects has to maintain his or her own brand. They have to have a sort of distinctive geometry or distinctive, so that for most of these guys, you should be able to recognize one of their buildings. And so that is another dynamic in relation to some of the issues we've been talking about this evening, about economic development. You've got this on the one hand, and historic preservation, conservation, and its role in urban regeneration on the other. How do you balance them? And it comes down to that scale, I think, the particular examples.
I've got a new term, which is wackitecture. That is, this thing that the wackier the better. And somehow if it's wacky, then it's great wackitecture. So, once again, this issue about making it look like look at me architecture as opposed to sort of polite architecture which contributes.
And if you don't get it, no explanation's possible. If you do get it, no explanation's necessary. That's the basis of architectural education. Speaking as a former dean.
Well, on that note, I've let us run over time very slightly. I'd like to thank our panellists, Dr. Gabor Demske, Elizabeth Vines and Paul Knox, for joining us this evening, and thank you to our audience. And please join us outside where you can have an opportunity to discuss these issues a little bit more. So from our own enigmatic signifier, as Kenneth Frampton called these iconic buildings that help landmark a city, thank you all very much for coming along this evening, and thank you to our panellists.